Computer. Good morning. We're here at the November IESSP business, or it's not a business meeting, monthly membership meetings. I wanted to do these membership meetings as a way for us to get to know each other outside of the annual conferences that happen in August. That's typically where we become acquainted and speak with each other. And the focus of the centerpiece of this meeting is an IE showcase. And then that's done today by Dr. Michelle LaFrance. And I will stop there. I'm Lanisha Adams. I'm the current IE division chair. This is holding my son, Donovan, who's 4 months. And I'm gonna go off video now so that I can change his diaper. And you guys just say your name, where you live, and say something about your IE research so that folks can know. I live in Washington, D.C., but I'm currently in Los Angeles for this kind of emergency family trip. But I'll stop there. So, and then I'll pop, if you introduce yourself, once you're done speaking, if you can say someone else's name. So I'll popcorn to Catherine Jenkins here. Catherine, you're still muted. Do I have to?
Yeah. Sorry, I think there's like a little lag with my internet. Sorry. Yeah. So hi, I'm Catherine. I'm one of the graduate members who received a membership for this year, for which I'm really grateful. And I'm based in Wales and London, and I'm researching, well, I'm using IE for my PhD project.
Awesome, thanks. If you can popcorn. So yeah, just say someone else's name and then they can introduce themselves.
Okay, Helen.
Hi. It's nice to meet you, Catherine, and looking forward to some other people that I haven't met yet here. My name is Helen. I live in Canada. I'm physically in Montreal, but I'm a student at the University of Ottawa, a PhD student at the beginning. So I haven't actually started conducting my research yet. I'm in the process of getting ethics approval. Using institutional ethnography to look at dying and palliative care amongst people in the federal prison system. Oh, right, and I should say someone else's name. How about Eleni?
Hello, everyone. I'm Eleni. I'm Greek, but I live in Manchester, England, UK. I'm a PhD student, physically located in Manchester, but I'm a student at Queen's University, Belfast, in Northern Ireland. And I use institutional ethnography for my PhD project. I am a student for a while now, but I haven't. I have the ethics approval, but I haven't really started yet because of the COVID. My project is on patient safety in radiology practice. So I use institutional ethnography to understand how radiologists learn to practice and practice patient safety. And can I ask Janet to continue? Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Janet Rankin. I'm in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And I am currently immersed in co-authoring a book with Marie Campbell that is an extension of both of our PhD work that now sort of spans through the 70s and into the 90s and into the years 2000, chronicling transformations in nurses' work. And so what I'm currently writing is a chapter around nurses' medication administration. And the other big explication that we're doing is in a new model of care that's been introduced to utilize nurses more efficiently in hospitals. So my focus is in hospital nursing. and this has been painful. It's a big project, and it's taking much longer than either of us anticipated. But I've been grateful that I've had a scholarship leave since July 1st. I go back to full-time teaching and committee work in January. So I'm really trying to stay focused during these last precious weeks of my writing. So thanks, Lanisha, for organizing this. Sorry, who hasn't? Colin, please.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you all today. My name is Colin. I'm a postdoc researcher at Concordia University in Montreal, but living and working in Toronto for now. My research is mostly around spaces where public law intersects with, public health intersects with the criminal law, and most of my research is focused on the criminalization of HIV non-disclosure in Canada. And I will pass it over to Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle LaFrance. I am an associate professor of English at George Mason University, which is in Fairfax, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to be speaking with you all today, if not only for the reason I actually put on a professional blouse, which for some reason just felt so luxurious, and yet I'm still in my bunny slippers. And so it's the, sort of strangely unexpected joys that we cling to in this pandemic situation that have kind of gotten me through some of the longer, harder days as everything has transitioned to online interfaces, and the material conditions of our lives are incredibly challenging right now, and yet we persist in our work at multiple levels. So my research, I started working with institutional ethnography as a graduate student in 2007. It's largely because one of my mentors, Dr. Gail Steigel, who is a sociolinguist, had heard Dorothy Smith speak. I was at the University of Washington in Seattle, and so she had heard Dorothy Smith speak when she was at a conference in Vancouver, Canada. And I was sort of talking through some issues as I was thinking about the sort of early stages of my dissertation work, which was on a core course in English that introduced English majors to the work of the English major, but also included components of writing. And I was very interested in the pedagogy of the site, but I said to Gail, we keep talking about logistics, right? Like our pedagogical conversations consistently devolve into these conversations about who's doing what and how things are happening. And she said, I have a book for you. And she handed me Dorothy Smith's Institutional Ethnography of Sociology for People, which actually said, right, the goal of ethnography can often be looking at how people do things, right? How things, practices, ideas, concepts, and the work that we do begin to take shape. And so from that point on, I've been pretty dedicated to trying to figure out how to do institutional ethnography in ways that reflect the context of writing studies. And how, we're not a field that does a lot of research. We're typically a field that's sort of come out of literary practice. And so there's a lot of interpretive, heuristic work, but we're really importing a lot of the sociological principles that have driven conversations about qualitative research, empirical research. We're imported all of these because it hasn't really been a part of our history. And so we're kind of at this great place in our field right now where we're really starting to think, well, what does it mean to make this sort of research-driven, this empirically research-driven narrative a central component of our work? How does that change your identity? How does that change how we think about what we value as researchers? And how does that change the nature of the way we narrativize, right, any aspects of our interests as researchers? And so I'm really delighted to talk to you today about some of those ideas and how work with Dorothy Smith's larger corpus and institutional ethnography has really helped directed and shaped much of my approach as a researcher in writing studies.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those intros. I don't think we missed anyone here. So Dr. LaFrance, if you want to jump into the primary focus of this meeting, your showcase, your presentation, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, that's great. It'll take me just a second to pull up my screen.
Did you want to share your screen with us?
I was hoping to share my screen.
So Lanisha, do you know how to do that?
I'm muted. Okay, let me see here. Do you have the capacity to share? I think
you go down to participants and you choose the person and you just hit share screen.
Yeah, Michelle, do you have that capability on your, when you scroll, when you?
I do not. It says that the host has disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh, okay. So let me
I'm trying
see.
to remember how I do it when I have my classes. I think I might actually, do you have a screen share button at the bottom of your screen, Lanisha?
I do, yes, I do, but it says multiple participants can share.
Yeah.
Okay,
If you click that, then I should have the ability to share my screen.
yep. Okay, cool. Thank you. And do you have that capability now?
I do.
Okay, awesome.
Great. Okay. All right. So as I said just a little bit ago, the work that I've been doing with institutional ethnography has really come at this sort of genesis of a lot of different overlapping conversations in the field of writing studies. We are a field that is primarily concerned with writing, right? And largely that's because historically we've come out of concerns about first-year college writing and have a history of really thinking rhetorically, right, as rhetorical scholars and as people who teach writing about how writing takes shape as a sort of process of student thinking, which has many different layers. Another thing that I'll just note is that we've only really just in this field started to think internationally as well, which is sort of a product of a sort of a US myopic approach to a lot of research. And so I am unable at this point to really talk extensively about the histories and theories of writing that come out of, for instance, European contexts or Asian contexts. And people are beginning to do that work in really interesting ways. But I don't think you'll see yet how we are really understanding a larger holistic understanding or sort of conversation about writing and writing instruction or sites of writing or writers or people who, who actually do the work of teaching writing reflected necessarily in this particular conversation. What I really wanted to do was to focus essentially on one of the reasons why institutional ethnography has really sort of taken off in our field right now, and it has. It's just sort of the interest in IE has mushroomed in really interesting ways. And so I'm trying to think through and map for myself why it is I think that this particular methodology is so keenly attuned to the work that we do in writing studies and how and why it serves us in a lot of interesting ways has been a component of the work that I'm doing in general. And I thought it might also be interesting to others outside of the field of writing studies then as a means to sort of reflect on the values of institutional ethnography as a set of tools or a framework or any of the ways that we might actually think about it as sort of shaping or framing our discussions about ethnography or our ethnographic work in some way. Now, the first thing I'll say is that, writing studies has had this sort of fascination with ethnography that is, of course, decades old. And that's probably not surprising, as ethnography, of course, has been in a number of different sites across institutions, across fields, across interesting concerns. And that's even despite a number of challenges, right? Critical challenges and challengers through the 70s and the 80s who, like Stephen North in our field, who said essentially that ethnographers only really enshrine lore and then circulate lore as opposed to come up with some other sort of more rigorous or robust understanding of a site. Or scholars like Patricia Sullivan or Peter Mortensen, who argued that we really need to pay attention to the sort of ethical inflections of ethnography because the representational politics sometimes are not as clear as they could be, right? And those sorts of challenges are not different from any of the sorts of of challenges people in other fields were kind of fielding or thinking through. But inevitably, even after 5 decades of attraction to ethnography, people continue to return to ethnography and writing studies because of what we might describe as its subversive potential. And I think that's a really important key here in a conversation in writing studies. We're really thinking about how we can explore lived experiences in ways that tell us more than just sort of top-down master narratives or institutional discourses that might be handed to us about particular sites, really trying to figure out how things are happening and what's happening and why, what's the context that shapes those sorts of experiences. So we have here on this second slide sort of a mapping then of the evolution of our thought around ethnography in the field of writing studies. And in '88, we were still talking essentially, as Laura and Asher were, about the sort of complexity of writing behavior, how ethnography and other forms of qualitative research really offer us a sense of what's happening in ways that controlled experiments could not necessarily capture, and that somehow we really needed to understand or balance the larger master narratives or quantitative narratives that we could produce with a sense of a sort of rich, finely grained sense of what was happening on the ground. And now we see, right, in the 21st century, people understanding ethnography more generally as a form of deeply theorizing the ways that researchers are attuned to epistemological and ontological questions as they pursue an understanding of lived experience, right? So we see again that people are really turning to ethnography and institutional ethnography in the field of writing studies out of the sense that it's really important to be inclusive, to really capture that sort of evidence and that sort of narrative that might be covered up by other forms of research, that we can really use these sorts of forms as a sort of reflexive, multifocal social justice effort, and really continue to think about how the institution, when we study up, takes on different shapes, different forms, and different levels of investment for those key players. And of course, then all of this really resonates with the sorts of conversations that are happening in the works of people who are thinking about publishing about and discussing institutional ethnography, right? This notion that we want to ground our research in the material realities of our institutional sites, really showing institutional context, right? And making things that have been invisible a little bit more visible, and really thinking about how we are all kind of coordinated across time and space to sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly act, right, in these sort of concerted ways to bring practice, identity, shared values, collaborative interactions to bear.
Go, baby, go.
So, again, all of this really reflects the work of Dorothy Smith, and in fact, really helps us think in really savvy ways, right, about sites of writing and writers. And Dorothy Smith's work actually gives us a vocabulary and a toolkit, right, a very flexible, very scalable toolkit to do this sort of work that we've sort of had, but we haven't had in such a comprehensive sense. Right. So even as we understand that Smith's work is not necessarily a series of check boxes, right, that ethnographers look for X or they look for Y, we can still sort of get a sense of this holisticness of a site, right, and the ways that we can consistently trends and other elements of a site that might be important to recognize across institutional locations or in a variety of different situations. Now, the other thing I'll say is that, I started my work as a writing program administrator, and there's something unusual about the field of writing and rhetoric or writing studies. It often has a very middleness to it, and that's largely because a lot of the people in our field are not just theorists or scholars or researchers, but we're also practitioners. We are often both faculty and administrators, and we're often in working in programs or situated in sites where we're training other faculty or talking to other faculty about what writing looks like, how writers learn most effectively, really negotiating a lot of sort of institutional expectations around the classes that we teach. There's a lot of weight put on people to learn how to write, and then a lot of weight put on the faculty who teach writing to think about particular aspects of what it means to write. And so this middleness, or this both-andness of our site really resonates, I think, with the sorts of complexities that institutional ethnography has afforded us for listening, for collaboration, for really uncovering the differences of investment and standpoint that circulate through sites where we often end up having a lot of responsibility, but not a lot of power, right? We often oversee faculty in a program by essentially developing curricula or putting together policies for a particular program or a course, but the department chair will be the supervisor of the people who then step into and enact those policies or interact with those texts that we've produced. We often are called on to report on the effectiveness of these sites, right? Using institutional measures. We're not always in charge of these sort of assessment practices that speak to what students are learning or what faculty are doing in the sites, where we are often in charge of curriculum or programs or other types of planning. And then, of course, writing programs themselves are these very institutionally mandated, highly structured, and incredibly hierarchical sites, particularly with a signature pedagogy, right? So that one program, even though there will be some commonality with other programs across the US, will often then have a particular pedagogy that is enacted. For instance, this is a service learning model campus, or this is a campus where we do community engagement, or this is a campus where we do writing across the curriculum or writing in the disciplines, right? And so not only then do we have these sort of institutional pressures and expectations that we're often sort of negotiating as professionals and as researchers, then these sites are also responsive to these movements toward identity and coordinated practice in ways that other areas of the university may not be. And then, of course, some of our most vulnerable community members also live and work within these communities, right? We have a high level of contingent faculty. In fact, first-year writing programs are often up to 95% contingent faculty, with either one secure faculty line that may or may not actually be on the tenure line, and then are often these classes serve first-year students who are sort of bridging into or socializing into academic communities for the first time, and there's an awful lot of unrecognized oppression that is enacted around language practices in these sites. And so we're really thinking then again about how the work that we do sort of speaks to this middleness, right? Student advocacy, faculty advocacy, and concerns around belonging, exclusion, and institutional expectation. So in my own work, I've been very appreciative of institutional ethnography because it's helped me push back against some of the master narratives of my own field, which have really tried to think in generalized ways about something like programs or first-year writing courses, or first-year writing even as an initiative that spans the US, right? And offering a sort of unified or sort of generalized sense of what's happening in these key locations, especially around pedagogy and pedagogical moves. So I've been able to really speak back to that sense that there's some sort of shared value system here by saying that in fact really what we're looking at is this sort of disorder and divergent and disagreement, these interactive tensions, right? And loosely related individual practices are the norm, and in fact we shouldn't be afraid of that, right? Nor step into research thinking that our narratives are seeking to control or to somehow smooth those differences. The more we can understand about the differences of investment, the differences of standpoint that sort of filter through and percolate through these programs, these sites of writing and writing instruction, the better attuned we are to being able to speak to those social justice opportunities that most of us really like to embrace. And so these processes of institutional mapping for me have been really helpful because I found them very nuanced, very emic, institutionally situated, right? So the tools that I'm taking from IE are really helping me think about structures that I may or may not see in my own institutional situation. They also resonate with ideas that we have about writing as a material and discursive act, right? And I'll speak a little bit more about that in just a moment. And of course, they are enabling me to invite people into these conversations with me as a researcher, understanding that everyone involved is active and knowing in some way, right? As opposed to a more passive object of my researcherly interest, right? And so Melissa Nicholas and I began to argue that one of the real strengths of bringing these forms like institutional ethnography into writing studies is that we really were enabled to systemically study the hierarchy and these systems of labor or professional systems of certification that we've talked about in other ways in our field. And I'll speak to that in just a moment, but really haven't had a sense of the really nuanced and emic approaches that would help us do this in a more regularized or more aware way. Now, since the 80s, we've been asking in the field of writing studies, what is the institution? And we've been trying to theorize the institution. And I think it's important to recognize that institutional ethnography is not necessarily about institutions with a capital I and the way that people in our field are constantly thinking about institutions or really trying to theorize institutions. And that's largely a product of our situation because we are almost entirely an academic endeavor, right? We exist within academic institutions, and that means we have some bounds and some constraints that other sites of study may not necessarily have. At the same time, institutional ethnography has allowed us to really think in quite savvy ways about what institutions are, sort of pushing that discourse forward, moving us away from simply thinking of institutions as rhetorical to really thinking about the materiality of institutions in ways that our field had not quite yet done. Right, so we get this sense that an institution, right, really changes its shape, really changes its nature based on the individuals who are approaching and interacting with that institution. And this is a really groundbreaking concept for a field like writing studies, who, you know, we tend to be very myopic about that first year writing site, right? That place that is sort of the genesis or the real center of the field's conversations. Because we, you know, again, we're generalizing, we're tending to over-unify what we're thinking about this site in ways that allow us to have that national conversation and to offer some real touchstones for scholarship, for research and practice. But then our scholarship and our research and practice has often taken on this quite generalized sense. And so really thinking about how an institution shapeshifts according to who we're speaking to, right? And what the function of a particular aspect of work might be has been really important for becoming more savvy about our conversations in that way. Additionally, in writing studies, we have talked about work, labor, and action as these touchstones for a number of years. We've really been concerned with labor because of the issue of contingency, right, in our field, and the ways that first year writing has been right on that sort of first line of defense around contingency. And so trying to, you know, differentiate between work, labor, and action has really taken up a lot of bandwidth in a lot of rhetorical conversations in the field, particularly as we've tried to think about, well, what can our response as a field be to the rise of contingency in the US? And what we're finding in these conversations about IE is that the more we can think about these terms being co-constitutive, writing being co-constitutive, that we can actually change the nature of those conversations and begin to tell different sorts of stories that perhaps actually enable us to do the sort of social justice work or the labor activism that we prefer to do in new ways that we hadn't really thought about because of our attachment to rhetorical theory and rhetorical understandings of labor, work, the institution, et cetera. Right. So we have this notion that writing is co-constitutive, right? That it's material, that it comes together in this moment where individuals are essentially negotiating mindfully the many different expectations and understandings and sort of ideations that are filtering through a particular site in order to come together with the opportunity to produce something like writing, and that this in effect is a sort of rhetorical action, right? And we have a huge apparatus of conversation around the rhetorical nature of writing, which is pretty blowing. But the more we then think about the materiality of that as well, and the ways that IE asks us to, the more we're continuing to challenge and push many of our own conversations and the sort of rote ways that we have begun to think about writing and think about student writing or think about faculty teaching writing in these sites that are so highly organized around institutional norms and ruling relations. The concept of work, I think, is the place where we're finding a lot of traction, because it really allows us to think in these very generative ways about how we put time and energy into the production of writing or into various conversations about writing, and how then the context of those conversations continues to inform us about what writing looks like, right? And how we might think about, Lucan and Vuong talk about the empirical bridges, right? So that this writing and our understanding of writing is not just a happening in this sort of accidental historical vacuum. It's actually a product of what people do and how people do it. And it is also taking shape in an array of different practices that are really interesting, but often have been ignored or elided or erased as other types of institutional discourses have come to the fore. The more we bear down on thinking about work as opposed to labor, right, this sort of rhetorical landscape of value systems that accrues around these sort of larger constructs of what people do and how they do it, the more we begin to think about the coordination of experience and the practices of, these highly structured practices that we can actually bring to visibility that are important to pay attention to or that haven't really quite been given voice yet. Additionally, the notion that work processes, right, these organizational strategies, right, are quintessential to our understanding of these sites has been really important for a lot of the work that we're doing. We could also talk quite a bit about the nature of boss text, right, in the sort of labor context or the employment context, and of course the pedagogical or classroom context of the sites that we study. And we're beginning to see people pick up this idea and really develop this idea around boss text in some interesting ways, which I'll come back to in just a moment as well. So largely, we've learned a lot from institutional ethnography about how to do what we do, what we're really invested in, right? And some vocabulary for these structures that were always sort of present, but weren't quite as coordinated, weren't quite as active in writing studies, which has been a phenomenal reflective moment for a lot of us who are sort of at the forefront of these conversations about what our research looks like, how we teach graduate students to do this sort of research, right? And how our research demonstrates what we value in ways that I think are really important. And that's the conversation that I would like to turn to now, right? And I want to show you some snapshots of what people are continuing to do in the field of writing studies, and to end with some emergent questions that have come out of this emergent, right, conversation. So my work, of course, is ongoing. My monograph came out in 2019. In my monograph, I argue that IE offers us a flexible, scalable, and finely grained holistic examination of practice, right? I'm really excited by the response to my book. I'm hearing that it's being assigned in graduate research methods courses. Increasingly, I'm being asked to talk, and other people are thinking about who else they could bring in to talk about institutional ethnography. But really, I think the takeaway from this is not that I have a book out or that my book is on IE, is that we're really coming to this moment where we're thinking as a field, right? And people who teach research methods we're really thinking as a field about not just what we value, but how we do what we do in ways that really reflect those values and those investments. And that's a terrific place to be in, because it's certainly not the place that we were in 20 years ago, where we were arguing about whether we should be doing quantitative research at all, right? Whether we valued quantitative research or whether it told us the sorts of stories that we wanted to hear. Instead, now we're having a much more savvy conversation about how what we do as researchers really reflects the sorts of stories that we would like to tell, and really brings to visibility the things that we think are important that haven't been given enough attention. How we do that ethically, how we do that in alignment with other movements, right, towards racial justice, disability action, and any of the other movements that are really structuring the field right now towards more awareness of support for student writers and support for faculty who teach writing, often in very vulnerable contexts. Additionally, I've done a good deal of co-authored work with Melissa Nicholas. We have 2 essays out that really looked at the standpoints of staff and faculty in writing center contexts. I did another lengthy institutional ethnographic project on information literacy, where I looked at how the relations of contingent faculty began to essentially help us understand how they taught information literacy. And we determined in that study that, in fact, the field's discourses and often the library's own discourses about information literacy didn't hold as much weight as the personal relationships that people had on the ground, which is a huge realization in a field that is dedicated to pedagogy and effective teaching, right? We had not been speaking about relationality to the degree that we could be, nor have we been talking about the complexities of our political economies and how those might impact the adaptation of particular pedagogies or the ways that people would enact a teaching style. I'm also delighted to highlight the work of Michelle Miley, who's at the University of Montana, who now has 2 articles out on institutional ethnography and has really become the person who's talking about institutional ethnography in writing studies contexts, right? Her argument has been that unless we're really looking at these sites as relational sites, we are losing a lot of information, and a lot of the arguments that we're making then are not just myopic or nearsighted, but also silencing, right? And that we have to better account for the investments and standpoints of all of the people who move through the sites that we are working in. And in fact, last spring, she was one of the featured workshops at the International Writing Center Association annual meeting, where she talked about student standpoint and the use of institutional ethnography within writing studies to work towards student advocacy. And so her voice is up and coming in our field, and she's just making some phenomenal contributions. I don't have a slide here for the work of Anne Ruggles-Geer and her team at the University of Michigan. What they did was they used institutional ethnography to help think through the ways that faculty in the disciplines begin to challenge the notions of disciplinarity that filter through writing in the disciplines curricular initiatives. That study was released in College Composition and Communication in 2018, and is another really great example of the ways people in writing studies are beginning to really think with the tools that institutional ethnography and the conversations that Dorothy Smith has given us to really offer more complex understandings of what people are doing and how they do it. And then finally, here are only 3 of, I've heard about dozens of dissertations coming out of writing studies in the last 5 years. And here are only 3 that I know. I know that the researchers fairly closely and was in conversation with them as they were developing their projects. Sarah Austin is used and defended a dissertation that was IE based on feminist pedagogy. Hillary Cohen was working on anti-racist activism and feminist invitational rhetoric in writing centers. And then Anissa Cox is about to defend her dissertation. I just read the full draft, which is just a fantastic treatment of labor equity and evaluation practices, the boss text of evaluation practices, it is a really interesting institutional ethnographic project, thinking about labor equity and sites of action that are organized by contingent faculty for contingent faculty within university contexts. Additionally, Melissa Nicholas and I have a CFP, which is in progress. We are working on the complete draft of an edited collection where we ask people to tell us how they had started to adapt institutional ethnography towards their own ends, either as writing and program administrators or as other researchers activating research and sites of study that are interested in writing. And we find that institutional ethnography really helps us to really think through the impact of austerity measures in U.S. higher education, particularly around the growth of contingency. And we have 12 chapters of people who are thinking with us then about institutional ethnography, the tools from institutional ethnography that they find most valuable, and the studies and projects and initiatives that they've been able to roll out under the sort of guidance, right, that it has offered as they've carried out their work. So I will end here by thinking about the emergent directions that I'm seeing across these conversations in the US. We as a field are really struck by the racial reckonings, right, that are happening in the US. We are really struck by the continued neoliberal politics of higher education in the US. And IE has become one of the tools that has allowed us to think in very savvy ways about how our research efforts can continue to talk back to those sorts of socioeconomic and political pressures, right, that we negotiate, that we face, and that inevitably shape what we do and how we do it. So we're increasingly seeing IE as one of the tools that we use as we think about research around anti-oppressive pedagogy and its impact. We are really thinking a lot about what it means to do assessment in ways that challenge linguistic racism or that challenge linguistic oppression. We're also thinking in alignment with the rhetorics of materiality, embodiment, belonging, exclusion, and ambient rhetorics, right? All those materialities that shape our sort of everyday experiences. And IE allows us to really think about how those things have been an unrecognized presence in much of our pedagogy, many of our classroom spaces, many of our labor and work spaces as well. And then, of course, it's a phenomenal tool to continue our work around labor and work studies. But truly, this is a moment where the field, right, and people who are deeply engaged in questions of research in the field of writing studies are really hungry for a series of newer critical frames that offer more savvy, more nuanced understandings of how our strategies and tactics really enable us to tell the stories that give us traction, that allow us to understand, historical erasures, and to support the sort of multivocal understanding of sites that we haven't necessarily had in the past, right? And then we're also thinking about how these questions and critical frames offered by AE might dovetail with our understanding of the increased pressure to engage communities off campus, right? What does that work look like, and how does it take shape? And so I just want to thank you again for the invitation to come and speak with you today. I hope this has been interesting and informative to giving you a little snapshot of how we do the work that we do in writing studies and the sorts of investments that we bring to the work. And I'm delighted to answer questions, especially those that challenge my frames or a sense of IE, because that helps us all, I think, be better and stronger researchers in the long run when we begin to really think about our key terms and our processes and our frames and how they mobilize what we do. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Dr. LaFrance. I'll open it up for anyone to engage, so you can unmute yourself and just pop in, ask questions. And yeah, I think we have a lot of food for thought after your presentation. Oh, Colin, if you're speaking, you're muted.
No, I'm good.
I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed the talk. My PhD is focusing on health information literacy, so for me, really relevant and lots of references to look at. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much. I do welcome, should you have questions, please feel free to contact me. I did have my email address in the slideshow, but I'll just type it here in the chat.
Yep, and I'll put it in the meeting notes as well.
Yeah, and I welcome your thoughts and your feedback and further conversation.
Sorry, is it okay? Maybe I'll just ask a quick question.
You bet.
Thank you so much for that. I thought that was so interesting. I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more. If I understood correctly, you were saying that sort of one of the contributions that IE helps you to get at is this idea that writing is co-constitutive. Mm-hmm. And that sort of, if I understood correctly, sort of enables or helps propel more social justice oriented sort of work and more sort of activist oriented scholarship. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about the relationship between those three aspects of your work.
Sure, yeah. You know, historically, people have really, until maybe about the 90s, people really had been theorizing writing in very generalized ways, right? Mostly mobilized by ideas that there would be a sort of standard English practice in the US or standard language practices, and that the goal of something like a writing class would be to focus on those rules, right? And on those sort of common practices. And what we've really begun to think about, linguistics led the way, right, is that in fact, language practices are far more diffusive, right, than that. There are all sorts of inflection points that are sort of left out of our understanding of writing if we're not taking into account you know, the people who work on multimodality would say design elements, right? Delivery elements. People who work on social linguistics would talk about the ways that there's an intersection between power and inflection, or power and patterns of language. And so, you know, we have those sorts of critical contests around the notion that there is a sort of generalized or unified understanding of language that we all share when we begin to look at language as a sort of local practice and begin to realize that, in fact, you know, what we might perceive as rules are also frequently broken under many different, for many different reasons in many different contexts, and that some people are able to break the rules more than others, right? And so when we begin to think about writing as co-constitutive, we're really thinking of it not as only the process of putting language on a page, right, and following a set of sort of grammatical or prescriptivist structures. We're really thinking of it as a sort of you know, a product of a social environment, right? Reflective of the environment that surrounds it. And that the writer, the speaker, is always negotiating and sometimes aware, sometimes not necessarily aware of the sorts of social expectations on them as a performer, as they're producing the written text. Now, this sort of notion of this kind of co-constitutive notion of writing then really changes how we think about the value and the practice of a writing class, right? Is our goal then to teach the rules when we know that the rules might fluctuate, might change, might sometimes have very high stakes attached to them and then sometimes not, right? Or is our goal to teach more of this sort of rhetorical and social awareness around where you find the resources, you solve problems as a writer, or begin to think about the context that surround what you're doing as a writer, as opposed to stay focused on, you know, something like what the perfect sentence looks like, right? So the more we can think about the way these social expectations really impact what writers do and how they do it, and the more we can help students be familiar with the way they solve problems, think about those contexts, and think about those contexts in very savvy ways, perhaps the more effective they will be then when they step into contexts where they're not familiar with what those expectations might be. They're set up to do a little bit more detective work, right? So we think of this as a form of advocacy for students, or as a form of social justice work, because we are essentially not acting as people who would say to students, well, that language is unacceptable here, right? Instead, we would change the nature of the conversation, right? We would say, let's think about the value of particular language practices, how these language practices gain their power in particular contexts, and how then we can be more savvy as people who write, who speak, who read, right, about those contexts, so that we can be a little bit more empowered in how we then perform as writers, as speakers, right? And so I think that's my very roundabout response to that question of how we would think about writing as co-constitutive as also being a movement towards social justice. Two other quick things I'll say is that in the 1970s, there was a movement called the Students' Right to Their Own Language movement that was umbrellaed under college composition and communication, which was one of the first efforts in our field to really think about how traditional writing courses and traditional college expectations often essentially told students that they had to leave their home language at home, right, and step into a world of academic language that we owned and they did not. And that in fact their success then relied on their ability to adapt our language practices and to disavow home language practices. There's been a good deal of writing about those sorts of efforts, and we have sort of renewed efforts around them. College Composition and Communication came out recently with a Black language activism statement, also saying, right, we want to understand things like African American vernacular English within their historical context and as a really important site of identity practice that we don't disavow, but that we understand as being worthy in its own right as a language practice, right, as opposed to a non-standard practice that doesn't belong in an academic situation. And so these two moves and these sorts of shifts towards rethinking what writing is and how we teach really echo with many of the values and practices that are central to institutional ethnography.
Thank you so much for that.
You bet.
I have a question that is in my head and may or may not come up clearly. This is the most exposure I've had to your field, Dr. LaFrance. Like I haven't really ever, had anybody speak or read anything about how your field is structured. And so I'm thinking of it from my own point of view as a graduate student in nursing, as a PhD student, who thus is, grading, coaching, like helping undergraduate and master's students with their writing. And it has struck me in that work that in that sort of disciplinary training within nursing, we're trying to do two things. Some nurses will go on to be bedside nurses and are expected to communicate in a certain way in writing, charting, being the primary example. Other people are being trained to be nursing academics. And I see that getting streamed along racial and class lines pretty early. And I see that then when that streaming doesn't happen as neatly as sometimes the institution would expect it to, or would want it to, that the students who are coming from, particular like marginalized racial and or class backgrounds are then finding that they don't know how to write within that academic set of expectations. I'm wondering what work using institutional ethnography in your field has revealed, but then also what the uptake of that work or the response to that work has been from so-called practice disciplines like nursing, where there is, a bit of a disconnect in writing expectations between the practitioners and the academics, and what that may or may not reveal about the student writer co-producing themselves as a, so that they're a laborer and a product in that writing process.
Yeah.
If you could to that?
Yeah, that's a very smart question. We don't really have IE work that speaks to that yet.
Okay.
We do have work that is coming out of the writing across the curriculum and writing in the disciplines field that speaks to the bind that both students and then faculty who teach writing in the disciplines find themselves in. Because, you know, the real world is interested in grammatical correctness, right? And this is a tough reality. To be a professional at a very high level, right, means that we have to acquire a number of very complex language practices that are no one's mother tongue, right? And some people do get a leg up on this than others, right? For instance, I have a colleague who I always refer to as a superhuman because she grew up in an academic family. And her parents were administrators. And so at her dinner table at night, they were talking about institutional politics. They were talking about the landscape of academics, right? Her parents were talking about the books that they were writing or the papers that they were writing. And so for her, the seamless move then into an academic lifestyle just felt natural, right? She had that long-term family-based socialization into those practices in a way that a lot of other people, I certainly didn't have it, right? And a lot of other people just don't have. And so you have, on the one hand, absolutely, right, these values in the outside world about grammatical correctness, proficiency, standard language practices, and very high stakes performances of often, you know, particular sets of language practices. And then on the other hand, right, the getting there is a lengthy process that is multi-layered, right? It's not just about learning grammatical rules. It's not just writing about one particular thing or writing one key text, right? Writers learn to write over a lengthy period of time, often through failure, often through finding sites that allowed them to be reflexive about where they had built some efficacy or where they had not. And it's incredibly difficult to often pull that off in a lot of undergraduate programs and graduate programs. So what we find in the research on student writers is that people are still learning to write as they enter into their sort of professional domains, right? They understand the stakes, they understand audiences more clearly, but they're still getting that sort of connection between audience, the stakes, the social context, the genres that they're producing in, right? And their own abilities to sort of reproduce, right, those many contexts with either new knowledge or new teams or working through voice, et cetera. So, you know, we haven't had a lot of institutional ethnography do that particular work, but we do have a lot of research that speaks to that bind of expectations of writers, understandings of standard academic English, standard English, right? And then this sort of proliferation of practice that is uncovered when we really look at who our writers are in university contexts, right? What they bring to these sites, and how they are asked to write, right? And the expectations of the people who read their texts or who look at their texts. And what we're finding is that it's very difficult to separate out language practices and the evaluation of language practices from these other power differentials, right? So absolutely, right? We have tracking within our, you know, academic context where some people seem to end up, right, in particular situations, and others may not be invited, supported as they sought to enter into those same locations, or really understood as sort of a good fit for those locations. And those are all understandings that are based in power, that are based in race, that are based in gender, that are based in ability, right, embodiment and materiality. And so you're asking exactly the sort of question that I hope people will continue to ask as they adopt IE and think about sites of writing and writers, because I think we do still have a lot of work to do, especially on the upper levels and the graduate levels, right, where we see people socializing into these expert practices in ways that we may not be able to describe or necessarily support just yet. That was a very long answer. I hope I answered the question for you.
Yes. I actually have another question, but I'm not sure how we're doing for time, if we need to move on to other parts of the meeting agenda.
No, go away, Helen. I think The last
Okay.
two items are very short, so it's not a.
And also if anyone else has questions, I don't want to take up all the time. This question's sort of a bit, maybe more tangential, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. I was recently, you know, as I said, I'm going to ethics, so I'm talking a lot about how I'm going to do my research with IE, having not yet done it. And I was rereading actually an article by Janet about some of the tools that IE offers. And one that struck me was, I think it's called writing accounts, where you would, at a certain point in analysis, go back and try and write a coherent explication of a particular piece of your data. And if you haven't actually explicated your data, that would be revealed in the writing of it. Mm-hmm. My question for you is, what is my question? Not sure I have a coherent question about that. There's something about that is catching my interest in terms of then writing and training, you know, bringing people into writing as a process, because it strikes me that you would need a certain level of writing skill to accomplish that. So I guess what my question is how your work can be taken up by researchers in helping them with their own analysis.
Oh, right.
Analysis of their own data.
Yeah, I think this is difficult because I think the process of coding data and the narrativizing a data story is very individualized, right? And so on the one hand, we have these key terms that institutional ethnography offers us, right? We have ruling relations, we have standpoint, we have something like a boss text or textual coordination. We have we have this attention to work or to work processes. So in some ways, those key terms offer us touchstones, right? As sort of beginning that process of coding and analysis of data, right? And yet you don't, I think, as a researcher, want to be so wedded to the notion that institutional ethnography happens a particular way, that if you're so attached to a key term looking a particular way, I think you can sometimes defeat the purpose of that sort of proliferation of diversity that institutional ethnography can help us begin to uncover, or the new story, or the forgotten perspective, or the erased perspective that institutional ethnography can bring forward. So for me, I think the takeaway and the struggle, right, is that we're trying to balance between what institutional ethnography offers us as tools for the sort of critical, often feminist appraisal of a site, right, that allows us to bring multiple voices into new understanding, fresh understanding of a process of studying up as opposed to looking down, right? But we also don't want those same sort of touchstones to orient what we do, or we end up re-erasing, right? Or re-particularizing stories, or telling the stories that we hope to tell as opposed to the site, the site's story. And that's a real challenge, I think, especially it was a huge challenge for me as a new researcher, where I definitely had my biases in my investments, and I still do, right? Have my biases in investments. And so I think using the touchstones of IE as starting points is phenomenal, but also thinking about how flexible, how scalable, and how particular they are, right? Meaning perhaps in this study, standpoint isn't necessarily as relevant as understanding a larger sort of organizational context, or vice versa. Maybe standpoint is really relevant here. And all of that comes intuitively from the study that you are conducting, your work with the data and your observations and your interviews and the texts that you've collected, and your sort of felt sense of what's going on, right? How things are happening in a particular site. And I think one of the other reasons why this form is so attractive is that that's a very heartfelt, but also intellectual and reflexive process of checking, rechecking, thinking, rethinking, free writing, right, your explication, and then going back and really thinking specifically, this term, does that work, right? What am I saying here? And becoming more specific about your own language and your own analysis. And so there's a real intuitiveness to the form of ethnography on top of the sort of intellectual deep investment in social, political justice, et cetera, right? There's a real intuition that kind of comes into play as well.
Thanks.
Well, great. Thank you so much for all of your questions. It's been phenomenal to talk with you all. And again, I welcome your email. And so I'll look forward to hearing from you and seeing you again at another meeting, or perhaps at an event, maybe even in person in another 6, 8, 9 months from now. And I probably won't be wearing my bunny slippers.
Or maybe you will. Awesome. Thank you so much. And yeah, if there are any questions, like I said, I'll share your email in the notes, in the minutes afterwards. We're going to, are you staying for the rest of the meeting, Michelle? Oh, okay. So a couple of things. Lauren Eastwood just sent me a note about ASA announcing that they are going to be having their conference all virtually now. And so the thinking is that perhaps SSSP will follow suit. They haven't said anything yet about that, but that has implications for, you know, kind of how we were planning to do our sessions. And I don't know what platform or technology they're going to deploy to have this conference. But I just wanted to put that on everyone's radar. It could also be that they decide to wait until the you know, rounds of vaccines are deployed and stay with it, because they already had a plan for an in-person meeting and partially virtual meeting. So still kind of uncertainty around that. And as it relates to this third agenda item for today around SSSP business, I'd been investigating possibilities to have the IE workshop, which typically happens the day, the Monday after the conference ends in August. I'd been investigating if we could do it offsite, because that provides more flexibility. The hotel has its pros and cons, the major con being costs around basic things like coffee and tea and water, and the sort of barrier I came into related to figuring out these costs is that the folks in Chicago, a lot of places that are ADA accessible and very close to the hotel, there's still so much uncertainty. So folks aren't really making plans to the end of, we will be doing something in person. So I'm kind of trying to get guesstimates, but you know, it's kind of, it's still to be determined. So I think our, the link for the IE workshop went live. But if we do go virtual, then that workshop experience will also, if the conference goes virtual, then the workshop experience will be completely virtual. And so it has implications for cost and also the number of people that we allow, and then the number of facilitators and how that is structured. So I just wanted to mention all of that. That's really important for logistics. And we do have an IE workshop committee, which will probably needing to be meet very soon once we know what the conference will look like in August. The last piece related to SSSP business, or two more pieces. One is the election, I think is open now. So if you check your email, you will receive some information about that to go and vote for Colin. Or to vote for the next IE division chair, which we already know will be Colin, or we really promote as Colin. I guess in the light of election madness, we there's a lot to be said there. But yeah, for our division, we typically ask the chairs to commit ahead of time. And then once we have the election, we know how it's gonna play out. And then the last piece was related to the IE podcast, and I still have to convene a meeting about that, but now I have about 15 people who have expressed interest, someone is writing their dissertation and then they're turning elements of it into a podcast. So that's really cool. And they're a SSSP member and they want to be on our committee. And this committee, this IE podcast committee, is to really look at how we will sort of launch a podcast. My goal was to do it by the start of the meeting, but the launching of that is just so that it's available. The work of doing the interviews, having it be edited, making it available in the places where you can listen to podcasts, all of that work still needs to occur. So that's it for SSSP business. And then in terms of IE network news, I usually do those via email, but I'm going to sort of open the floor. We have about 15 minutes left. So if other folks want to report out on what they know, we have a virtual reading group. We have a couple Facebook groups. There's all the Dr. LaFrance, you have all of the pulse on what's happening as it relates to IE in your field. And so if you know of meetings coming up, talks happening, this would be the space and time to mention those before we fully close out the meeting. We have about 15 minutes left. So does anyone have any updates, any thoughts, anything?
I just wanted to say that I would love to be involved with the podcast in any way if possible. It sounds
awesome.
Sounds great.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll add you to the list, and when we have our first meeting, I will, or when I'm planning the first meeting, I will invite you to say when your availability is. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I just had a quick, hi. I just had a quick question about one of the sites that I joined, and it was a group for IE that I think you posted, Manisha, and nobody seems to have gotten back to me. I don't know how it's working or if it's
is it the change from below site?
That's it.
Yeah. So let's talk offline about that. I saw your notice, but it's alive, and everything is fine there, but we're not actively promoting its use. So I think there's some questions about that, but I'm happy to see you have registered there and all of that. But yeah, we'll talk offline. Okay,
no problem. Thank you. Oh, and I'm interested in the podcast as well.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think this podcast will give a lot of life to so many things as it relates to IE. I mean, the more I talk to people about it, the more it just blossoms out. Like, I already think we have 5 seasons already, potentially to roll out. So it's very exciting. Helena.
Yes, so I just want to say about the study group. I don't know if it was the IE perspective that you were referring to. So
yes.
So the IE perspective is a virtual study group and reading club. But we do have a Facebook group, of course, with quite a lot of members. But I think that few will leave the group because they don't really participate. We met in October and we read a paper, one of the earliest Dorothy's papers, and I think it went it was pretty nice. I think that, yes, Catherine was there. So I think we had fun, and what was very nice was just we got the opportunity to chat with each other and get to know each other. It was very nice. So now we have a second meeting arranged for December the 10th. Of course, the time zones vary. So for some people will be early morning on Friday, but we try to, we doodle the date so people can choose what's convenient for them. And the plan is, and what we have done till now is that we record the meeting. So, and then it's on YouTube, but only for members that are in the club, and so in the reading club, in the study group. And also the sound recording is available on podcast platforms. I didn't want to interfere with the podcast that the SSSP prepares, so I called it slog, like sound blog. But it is there, and I thought it would be a good idea to have our discussions there, both for those members that for some reason couldn't join a meeting, and also because it became clear from our discussions, and it's also always clear, especially for those that are feel or that are young in the institutional ethnography field. It's so important to have access to information and access to experienced and knowledgeable people. Like here, this group now has like so many people that are experienced in institutional ethnography. So for people like Kath and me, and possibly Helen, it's very important that we have access to you all. So this is amazing. Your generosity is amazing, and I think that both the podcast and the idea of having what we discuss, having it online for people to listen, to go to have a reference to, is very important. So yes, and for our next meeting, we're going to discuss again Dorothy's paper, From the 14th Floor to the Sidewalk, Writing Sociology and Ground Level. Yes, I don't know. I don't know if Catherine wants to add something about it, because she's a member of the group.
I would just reiterate really how useful it was. It's great to read a paper alongside other people and then have a chance to discuss it, because often I end up reading one paper lots and lots of times to try and like get it in to my head. So it was really useful to just have that forum to just discuss quite informally, anything we didn't understand, and then like wider topics outside the paper as well. So thanks for setting it up, Eleni.
Awesome. That's exciting that it's growing, and it's you have upcoming meetings still yet. Were there any other updates, comments? We sort of have open floor for whatever folks would like to mention, and I'll wait a couple of minutes, and if we don't say anything, we will end the meeting.
I don't know if this is relevant, but I'm at Queen's University, and we are starting up our feminist ethnographic study group. And because we're on Zoom these days, it will be public, and we will be having sessions that address institutional ethnography, and hopefully a reading group will be emerging from that, which we plan to open up to the wider public. So it's something that I can keep people posted on, but that is another avenue that folks are going to be taking on here at Queen's.
Awesome. Will you, I'll circle back with you on the links for that. Do people sign up and, get access and all of this so that I can circulate it?
Hi, Lanisha. Sorry for joining. I'd just like to thank you for making it known, all these venues and forums that are out there. Many are new to me. Many I've become involved in thanks to the information you shared. And I want to echo Catherine's point about how helpful it is, especially if you're new to institutional ethnography, to have these forums to participate in. And even if you've been around a little while like me, they're still really helpful. So thanks again, Lanisha, for sharing the information about the new forums that you've discovered.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sorry, hear my son Davidson in the background laughing.
I wasn't trying to make a joke, Davidson.
He's still laughing. So if folks are if we're done sort of sharing and convening together, I will close the meeting. I think every time we've had this so far, we've ended it laughing, which is always a good sign considering all the craziness that's happening in the world. So I will close the meeting and then circulate the minutes and then the links to this recording. Thank you so much, Dr. LaFrance, for a very enriching conversation this morning, and also more and more things to think about. So yeah, thank you everyone. Talk to you soon and see you at the next meeting, which will be next month. The date is escaping me at the moment, but yeah, that will be in the minutes, the details.
Okay.
Thanks so much,
Thank you very
everybody.
much.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.